So welcome everybody. It's Oscar season and I've been thinking about the movies. So not really because of that, but in general, I am truly delighted to talk to Annette Insdorf today. In 2021, Annette was honored by the Telluride Film Festival as, quote, a hero of cinema, someone who preserves, honors, and presents great movies. She's done that for decades as a moderator and commentator at both Telluride and Cannes, as well as through her writing. I'm sure many of you have attended her wonderful interviews with filmmakers at the 92nd Street Y. But in addition, and in some ways, maybe most importantly, Annette has helped create generations of filmmakers as a beloved film professor at Columbia University. When I posted online about this event, one of her students commented, "Her course changed my life." Plus, Annette has an incredible, inspiring personal backstory that itself would actually, I think, make a great movie. So without further ado, here's my Valentine's Day gift to all of you. Welcome, Annette Insdorf.
Thank you very much for such a kind introduction, Julie.
Well, it's easy, it's true. So we are in Oscar season. And actually, there have been a number of interesting movies up for awards this year. So are you an Oscar junkie or do you loathe the Oscars and not want to deal with them at all? So tell me what this season means to you.
Oscar junkie would be going too far. Even Oscar prognosticator would be going too far. But I confess that I enjoy the actual ceremony. I generally watch it with friends, and we do a lot of yelling at the screen or throwing popcorn or whatever seems appropriate. And even the lead up to the Academy Awards, which now includes that cumulative progression where you go from the Gotham Awards, and then there's the Golden Globes, and then there's the SAG Awards and New York Film Critics Awards. It becomes a kind of cottage industry. And I'm more of an observer than a direct participant, but I do vote with certain groups. And what's the word I'm looking for? I'm simultaneously skeptical and cheerful when Oscars are on us.
Well, I think that's a very kind and thoughtful answer. And, you know, I personally just like to look at the clothes. I admit it, you know, it just, so you've been teaching at Columbia for many, many years now. And during that period of time, I think you started in, was it 1987? And so filmmaking.
Columbia, it's been 40 years.
Wow. So filmmaking and the world of movies have changed a lot in that time, dramatically. The way we watch movies have changed. And so I have two immediate questions about that. One is, how have students changed in that time in terms of the way they see the world and the stories they want to tell? Maybe they haven't changed at all. And then part two of that question is, have you had to reevaluate the way you teach about film because of those changes?
Well, I mean, the changes in film education mirror the changes in society. I don't know that on a very basic level, the nature of cinematic storytelling has changed all that much. Students and non-students feel they have compelling stories to tell. What's changed is the diversity in voices, and to some extent, the nature of filmmaking that has gotten less expensive, less cumbersome. With digital material, students and others are more likely to try out personal stories, sketches. You don't have to spend thousands upon thousands of dollars to do a test run for a short. It's possible to try it out in a less expensive format and then see where it goes. But when I say diversity, because I think this answer covers both of your questions, you know, we've been in moments of reckoning over the past, particularly, I would say, 6 years or so, and it came to a head in 2020 with COVID changing the way we were seeing films and to some extent making them, and with the murder of George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, and an increasing importance of widening the frame so that different voices, different stories could be added to the ones that might have been expected. Now, at Columbia, we have always had a slightly higher number of female students in the MFA
Hmm.
program for screenwriting, directing, and producing. When I say always, it means at least since the time that I took over as chair of the graduate film division in 1990. Beginning then, we've made an effort to make sure that we're nurturing the voices of women as well as men, and now all identities. I don't want to limit it to those. And we are the perhaps largest school in the country, maybe certainly in the MFA world, when it comes to international students. In my classes, I have at least 12 different countries represented when I teach
Oh,
analysis of film language. Their backgrounds are different. Many of their cultural assumptions are different. If lately my classes have focused a bit more on the way films have tackled racial issues in this country. Last week, I showed Dee Reese's Mudbound, for example.
mhm.
That means a lot to the African American students in my class. It kind of leaves my Asian American students a bit bewildered. So in teaching, I'm now increasingly sensitive to the numerous ethnic strands, the cultural backgrounds. So I don't think I can any longer teach, for example, the way I did when I first came to Columbia, the great white men, dead men approach to film history through auteurs. You have to widen the frame, as I said, a little bit. There are very exciting stories that are being told, whether through feature screenplays that are written by my students, short films directed by them, but I don't want to leave out the huge numbers of undergraduates that I teach. Many of them are film majors, film and media studies, we now call it. And many of them do plan to become practitioners, creative artists. Some will apply to graduate schools, for example, like Columbia and NYU and USC and the AFI. Some of them will go on to grad school for a PhD or at least an MA because they want to be professors, scholars, curators, program administrators. So I have a very wide range of students at Columbia, and they keep me on my toes.
Yeah, no, I can imagine. And just sort of following up on that, because I know for myself, I was thinking of when I was a film critic many years ago, the way you saw a movie was to go to a screening room and see it on a big screen. And, even to this day, still my number one favorite way of seeing a movie. And certainly during COVID, it was very distressing, actually, not to be able to do that. And I was wondering, among your students, do they have that passion for the big screen, or is that just completely a thing of the past?
I have to make a distinction between the way that my pedagogy works and some of the other professors of film, certainly in the United States. And that is that I insist on doing the screening in class. It's part of the 4 hours that we are there. They
Mhm.
have to see it not only on the biggest possible screen so they can catch all the visual details and sonic as well. They also have to see it in a group, a communal experience, the way I think motion pictures were meant to be experienced. And therefore, I build it in. I know there are quite a few film professors who believe that you can do the screening either separate from or that students can just watch it on their own. And for me, that is simply not possible for the best of film education. Now, during the pandemic, of course, what could we do? Almost, it's going to be 4 years in March. We all had to pivot. And I was one of the luckier people because I got used to Zoom. I mean, the very fact that I'm kind of comfortable right now, it came from, doing all of my classes on Zoom for Columbia and for the 92nd Street Y. Because I've been with the 92nd Street Y even longer than Columbia. I started with them way, way back around 1981. And while it pained me that the 92Y audience and Columbia had to watch the films on a small screen, I was so grateful that the films existed on the small screen at all. I've been teaching for so long that I've developed an emphasis on close analysis. In other words, I'm not much of a theoretician, in my opinion, but I am a historian and a great believer that great films tell us how to watch them. I wrote a whole book about that, Cinematic Overtures, how to read openings. No, Cinematic Overtures, how to read opening scenes, because the best movies tell you in the first 2 or 3 minutes what the basic themes and stylistic approaches are going to be. And so you enter that world and let the film tell you, lead you to the rest. I was able to do that during the pandemic. And frankly, even since then, a lot of students, how do I put this? From the pandemic on, a lot of students have become more emotionally fragile, more
Mhm,
delicate. And
mhm.
sometimes they have issues, physical, mental issues that prevent them from actually coming to campus on occasion. COVID itself has claimed a lot of students email me this semester. Sorry, I just tested positive for COVID. So I'm grateful that they can still take the class. And that if they miss one of my classes, I can share with them a recording from when I taught the course on Zoom. So you make do with what you have. And even if you cannot always share the communal and largest screen experience, you still get a sense of the magic of the cinema and of the best ways to learn how to read the films.
I really appreciate that answer. And it actually reminds me of what I admire so much about you is that you both have a, incredible depth of knowledge and scholarly approach to film, but you also have a moviegoer's love of films. And that definitely comes out in the interviews at the Y. And so I'd love to talk about those for a few minutes because they have become sort of just such a part of the of New York cultural scene. And I was looking back through some of your old interviews, and I think it was when you were someplace you talked about interviewing Richard Gere at the Y, and the first thing he said was, "Where's Cecile?" And Cecile was your mother, who herself was, I remember meeting her, was quite an extraordinary woman. But how did Richard Gere come to know your mother?
To make a long story short, my mother was possibly the most remarkable person I've ever met. She was a Holocaust survivor, Polish Jewish, who lost everything and everyone during World War II. She was in Auschwitz as a prisoner, liberated at Bergen-Belsen, met my father after the war in Paris, had me, we moved to the United States, and she managed to create a whole new life. She decided to go back to school and she got her PhD in French literature from CUNY Grad Center and then proceeded to teach as an adjunct at Hunter College for 33 years. After my father, also a Holocaust survivor and a wonderful man named Michael Insdorf, after he died young, I think in 1985, my mother was bereft and I started taking her with me to every screening and premiere and party and even to film festivals, with the great exception of Telluride, because I knew that the altitude there in Colorado would make her crazy. And I didn't take her to Cannes either, because I was always working at that festival day and night. But when she would go to, you may have been at some of these events,
Yes.
or film critics circle dinner, when I would introduce her to various movie stars, I mean, she was so adored by Daniel Day-Lewis and Liam Neeson, and Meryl Streep and Richard Gere. They were astounded by this woman who was a professor at Hunter College of French Literature, who had this accent, but you couldn't quite place it because it wasn't purely Polish or purely French. And anything that she ever asked of them, like come to my class at Hunter College, done. I had to beg and, cajole to try to get them to the Y, but for anything. My mother adored Richard Gere and vice versa. And when she would see him at parties, she would very often say to him, "Richard, it's time to come back to the Y. Annette wants you for an interview on stage." And he would go, we'll work it out. We'll work it out. And then nothing happened. So one night she saw him at a party and she said, "Richard, my daughter, the Y." Within a few months, he was there on stage. So the first thing he said is, where's Cecile? And when she raised her hand from the first row, he said, you see, I'm here. I made it. You happy? This is this sort of delightful dynamic that my mother's presence invoked.
Well, that's great. Well, say like mother, like daughter. And so your childhood must have been pretty crazy though, right? You were born in Europe. Um, could you tell a little bit about this? This is the American Jewish Historical Society. We want to know where people came from, what your early years were like, if you can remember.
I don't know if I remember it. I remember what people have told me about it.
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
But we went, I'm one of the few people who can say, I went from Paris to the Bronx. That's what we did. I was 3.5, and we lived on the Grand Concourse, which at the time was magnificent. Actually, it felt very European. The Champs-Élysées and the Grand Concourse had very similar vibes, if I can put it that way. And then when I was about to go to junior high school, we moved to Forest Hills. That's where I spent my formative years, including Forest Hills High School. And then I went to Queens College. Now, what can I tell you? My childhood was no crazier. In fact, I think it was very stable and loving. My parents had lost a lot, and they were not bitter. They had found each other, and then they frankly showered on me so much love and support. I mean, of course, there were expectations on their part that I realized only later in life. Like,
Mhm.
my life was not a given. I never should have been born, given that the Nazis tried to exterminate the Jews of Europe, and many of all my grandparents were killed. I never knew them. But they didn't dwell on that, not on the horror or the bitterness or the legacy of pain. They were very upbeat. And my mother was a shining role model of resilience to go back to school and get your PhD in 3 years. It took her 3 years. So, honor bound, when I got to Yale Graduate School to do my PhD in English, I thought to myself, she did that while raising me, and I'm going to have to do my PhD in 3 years too, because otherwise it's like I'm slacking off in family expectation terms. But the main thing was, it's hard to phrase this, but I'll put it as best I can. They had suffered so much and had lost so much that I realized there was an expectation that I would make up for that. I was named for my mother's mother, and I was told by many, many people that I have an incredible resemblance to my father's sister who was killed early on. So I knew that I can't consider my life like, oh, I'll do what I want. My life was a gift, and I have to live it that way. I have to live it with the understanding that it's not a given, and that every day I have to make that life worthwhile, not just for me, but for anyone I come into contact with. So that would be the most direct legacy from my parents.
Well, that's beautiful. You know, I read someplace about you talking about your dad. You know, I think a lot of people knew your mother because she was such a presence in the New York film world for sure, and such a, really incredible woman. And your dad sadly died before he had the chance to become as well known to the greater world, but he was well known to you. And I think at some point you said that in some ways maybe he planted the seeds for your career in film. Could you talk about that a bit?
Sure. My father loved movies in a
Mm.
different way from my mother, who was more analytical or sort of cerebral. My father just loved movies. And every weekend when I was growing up in the Bronx, we would go to one of the local movie theaters. Usually it was Sunday matinee. Within a 4-block radius, there were 3 movie theaters in the
Oh,
Bronx.
wow.
And he, he loved it then. And as he grew up, I'm sorry, as we all grew older, he loved the movies even more. And whereas my mother had very high and strict expectations, for example, I had to get all A's in school. She would like be on my case that there couldn't be a single missing comma in a sentence. There couldn't be a single repetition of the word that in a sentence. which, by the way, is how I grade my students' papers these days. But my father was more like, he would go, enjoy your life. He didn't want me to be um, overly concerned about scholarship. He was a jeweler and a watchmaker on
Uh,
47th Street in Manhattan's Diamond District with his two brothers. They were very close. The three of them survived the war together.
mm,
Uh, and he's the one, I think, from whom I inherit a certain jovial cheerfulness. Um, he was extremely, what's the word I'm looking for? Democratized. He would treat every single person the same way, whether it was a janitor working at 10 West 47th Street or some professor colleague of my mother's. He had no hierarchy. My
uh-huh, uh-huh.
my mother was a bit of a snob. I mean, loved the movie stars. She was very close to presidents of Hunter College and others. She had a sense of hierarchy. My father had none, and I think I'm closer to my father on that.
Amazing. Did they meet after, they met after the war?
You know how they met? A blind date at the circus.
Oh, I love it.
Those are my art. It was a blind date at the Cirque d'Hiver, which was the
Uh-huh,
winter circus in Paris. That's
uh-huh.
set up by mutual friends. And even though I think my mother was kind of hesitant, I think she always assumed she would marry something of an intellectual. She was such a voracious reader, and but they did marry, and I have no siblings, but we were a rather tight threesome.
Oh, that's great. Beautiful. Um, so on your bookshelf, I see a book which I have on my bookshelf, Indelible Shadows, which is a book about films and the Holocaust. Um, this is the American Jewish Historical Society. So I asked everybody this question about Jewish identity, which is a complicated question, maybe more complicated every day. Would you say that your Jewish identity is tied to the Holocaust, to something else? What does, is it to the movies? What does being Jewish mean to you?
Since we don't have a whole hour for me to answer that, I'm going to try very hard to distill it as best I can. First and foremost, yes, it's my identity is inseparable from the Holocaust legacy. Again, aware that I got to be born, I get to live, and yeah, to some extent, in place of many, many ancestors who were killed. So I, how do I put this? If I have become even slightly engaged in causes that have nothing to do with Judaism, whether it is, increasing the number of films dealing with racism in my curriculum at school, whether it is giving money to charities, Ukraine, and other areas that have nothing really to do with Judaism, it all stems from being Jewish. In other words, the very notion of tikkun olam, of repairing the world, of compassion, of generosity, these are my values. And I know how much these values are rooted in the best aspects of Judaism. I was raised conservative Jew. We went to
Mhm.
synagogue only on high holy days. We celebrated Passover and, of course, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, but not anything else. I actually became more Jewish in terms of observance when I went off for the first time outside of New York to graduate school at Yale. Suddenly, I wasn't surrounded by 90% Jewish friends and classmates. And I started attending Friday night services. When I moved to Paris for 6 months, when I was 29, um, a friend at the time, Tobin Cohane, sent me with some package to deliver to a rabbi in Paris. And that turned out to be a bit of a turning point. I met the rabbi and his wife, and they gave me a little candle to light for Friday night. They said, light this candle on Friday night, and you'll see that there'll be something more special added to your life. And it was true. I mean, I started thinking about one day a week that's special, that's different, where you don't just do your business. You think about something beyond you in terms of time, continuity, historical, and movie,
Mhm.
and in terms of your space as well, making it sacred. Now, that didn't hold so well when I came back to New Haven and was teaching, very busy. But after my father died, I became interested in going to Friday night services again, and I started dragging my mother, who had no particular interest in it. And in the late 80s, that's when it began. Through the 90s, I would take her to B'nai Jeshurun. That was our
Mhm.
favorite Brotherhood Synagogue, Gramercy Park. And we really enjoyed that. We that was another layer. For me, it was a way to be close to the heritage of my father as well as my mother. To this day, starting with the pandemic, it all went online with I love Central Synagogue. The Rabbi Angela Buckdahl is one of my heroes. And so every Friday evening, with the possible exception of the New York Film Festival opening night, I am in front of my laptop, like right now, for the service that begins at 6 p.m. because it lifts me up and it makes me think about what do I want most to do in this world, to help in this world. There's wisdom and beauty and reverence. So I still do it. And I've even forced my recalcitrant husband, Mark, who, poor guy, he went to yeshiva, so his feelings about Judaism are pretty mixed. He had a hard time, but he'll join me, especially towards the end of the Friday evening service, and then we light a candle together and we say the prayer over the challah and a glass of wine, and it's special. I look forward to it, and I try very hard. I do not always succeed. I try very hard to turn off the laptop and to not make phone calls or texts. I try because I want to delineate normal daily time, from special time, from spiritual time.
And that's really beautiful. And I will tell the audience that I can imagine for you to do that takes a big effort, because right up to the minute we started this, you were checking to see if your students had texted you a message.
Oh, actually,
So,
no, let me just correct that. Nobody texts me, emailed me, because
oh, emailed, sorry.
no, I'm saying that only because I don't give out my cell phone number unless it's to
Was.
for an emergency, simply because I don't completely turn off my phone in class or in movies in case there are emergencies that are coming in.
So I have a question from somebody in the audience who wants to know just a little bit more about your parents' experience and perceptions before the Holocaust, whether they had a sense of the horror that was coming forward, or were they in denial, or what? And also, how did your parents and your father's brothers survive?
Oh boy. Well, my mother always said that she has no idea that it was luck, but I believe that the reason she survived Auschwitz, for starters, was that she was with her mother. Her
Mhm.
mother, to some extent, protected and nurtured her. My mother, to some extent, protected and nurtured Anna, her mother. And when they got to Bergen-Belsen, though that was the worst, they both had typhus. It killed I can never say my grandmother because I never, it killed my mother's mother. At
Yeah.
which point my mother was completely decimated. I mean, she was pretty sick to begin with. And to have your mother die 11 days before the liberation, that was a real tough thing for her. She was temporarily blind. She went blind, but I think it was a kind of, psychosomatic blindness. And after the liberation, she was taken to Badischl, which was a displaced persons camp.
Mm.
My father's story is long and complicated. In fact, I tried writing a screenplay about my father's experiences, which are much lighter comparatively than my mother's. He was hidden with his two brothers by Polish peasants in the woods. People who initially took him in because there was some money offered, but who kept them for a very long time at great risk to their own lives.
Mm.
He escaped from a forced labor camp and then was hidden. And it was my father's cousin, Andrzej Kornhauser, who was the hero. He engineered the escape. Um,
Mm.
he was in love with my father's cousin, Ruja. After the war, he was, let's say, in much better condition than my mother was. But separately and for different reasons, they ended up in Paris. Before the war, I don't think that my mother had any sense of what was coming because my mother was the daughter of a captain in the Polish army who had
Mm.
served so nobly in World War I that she was one of only 2 Jewish girls who were allowed to attend the state school instead of a Jewish school. So she was privileged. As she said, I got toys from Marechal Piłsudski. I mean, she was very proud of this. And my father, he didn't live in a shtetl, but he lived in a small town where Jews and Christians had very good relations. So his parents owned a kind of general store that made fresh ice cream, So they didn't know. They had no idea, I think, until the war actually began.
Wow. Yeah, thank you so much. So I'm wondering, listening to all these stories and also just the very compassionate way you talk about, compassionate may be the wrong word, but your openness to stories of diversity and your strong feelings about tikkun olam and all of that, and teaching at Columbia, teaching at any university right now, especially since October 7th, have the politics of Israel and Gaza come into your classroom? And in what way, and how do you deal with that if you've had to deal with it?
I'll be honest, if I speak about only my experience, as opposed to anything that you hear about Columbia in general, no, none of my students have said, I'm not coming to class because I'm going to a demonstration.
Hmm.
None of, I mean, my students are very serious, especially the MFA students. This semester, I teach primarily MFA. They pay high tuition. The last thing they want to do is waste a class. I mean, they want the education that they're paying a lot for. So in my classroom, it hasn't come up. But of course, when I'm sitting in my office and there's a demonstration right underneath my windows, which is the case often, I hear it, I'm aware of it. But as my husband pointed out to me, remember when you were a student, 68 and beyond, that's what students do. They protest. They make their voices heard when they think there's something happening that needs attention. I worry when I hear anti-Israeli rhetoric, but Columbia is one of those campuses that is devoted to free speech. I mean, if you say, no, you can't say that, then in a month, somebody will say, well, you can't say, that Jews are good guys. I mean, there'll be some kind of effect further down the pike. So I am aware of one major thing. The news always is about the loudest voices and the most violent actions. It's never about, look at all these Columbia students who clearly in the classroom are not only civil, but they reach out with compassion, even if they're from opposite sides of, let's say, the Palestinian and Jewish divide. You don't hear about that in the press. You hear only about noisy demonstrations where, someone might have been attacked, assaulted. I don't believe that Columbia is anti-Semitic as an institution. I don't believe that the loudest voices even are anti-Semitic. I do believe that some of the students see the images that are coming out of Gaza, and they feel that as human beings, they have to make their outrage noticed. It's that simple. And I can't
Yeah,
be the judge of what they can say or not.
great. That's a beautiful answer. And it sounds appropriate and also great to hear, because I completely agree with you. So there we go. So back to the movies. So for me, some movies are comfort food. I go back to some movies over and over again, and they aren't always even good movies, even not great movies, but they're movies that are sort of I don't know, they just are movies that I need to see. Most of them are pretty good, great. But I wonder if you have movies like that. Just, I mean, I know I read someplace you see 400 movies a year, so
In a month.
at least probably. Yeah, I was thinking about that, probably a minimum. So maybe you don't have time to go back, but do you?
Well, let me put it this way. The default channel on the large screen TV in the living room is TCM. Channel 82, that's, if I need something to look at before going to sleep, and my husband Mark is the same, give me an old black and white movie that cleanses my eyes a little and then I go to bed. Um, so often I'll turn on TCM and there's a film I've seen, how many times, but like Casablanca, it suckers me in every time. I know the dialogue by heart. I know exactly what's going to happen, but I want to exist in that world for a few minutes because it's a world of noble characters and causes and a very smart mise en scène and editing and the music. It's just one of those movies. The best years of our lives would be another. Um, my own films, so because I teach cinema history 1960 to 1990 in the fall at Columbia, and analysis of film language in the spring, where I basically break it down into thematic, well, not thematic, the elements of cinematic storytelling in a different film each week that illustrates it. So I will see certain films as many as 30 times because I watch them often, again, with my students. Yesterday, I've been showing Kieślowski's Decalogue.
Mhm.
Krzysztof Kieslowski, the Polish filmmaker, is for me possibly the greatest director of the past 50 years.
Mhm.
And the Decalogue, these 10 one-hour films that are loosely based on the Ten Commandments, are extraordinary. And I wasn't going to watch Decalogue 3 and 4 yesterday, but I sat down to just watch the beginning and make sure the sound and image were good. I stayed the whole time and found new things despite the 26 times I've seen it, whatever before. And in the other course, yes, I have seen Bertolucci's The Conformist and Jean Renoir's Rules of the Game and John Cassavetes' Woman Under the Influence, which I'm showing tomorrow. Truffaut's Day for Night. Philip Kaufman's The Unbearable Lightness of Being, I show every single fall semester. I live in these films, and these films live in me. They are rich. They're first of all aesthetically, formally rich. I mean, every camera angle is the right one that was obviously chosen from among other possibilities, but it's also the stories they tell, the characters that I identify with, the values that the films engage in me. But as you know, I watch all the new movies. I've seen pretty much every single major film release of 2023. When the Academy Awards broadcast, takes place in early March, I will have seen everything except all of the animated shorts, animated features, and probably live action shorts. I'm going to try to see them. And my favorite films of the year list that I do, they are less about the quality of a given film than about how that film corresponds to my values, worldview, and priorities. So that, for example, The Zone of Interest easily ended up on top of my list because though it's formally rigorous, German language drama about the commandant of Auschwitz and how he and his wife try to raise their children in a villa right next to the concentration camp that we never see but always hear, that to me was showing something fresh in terms of
Yeah.
approaching what I now call the genre of Holocaust cinema. And I thought the best television miniseries, but I shouldn't say this because I haven't seen all of them, but I loved A Small Light,
Oh,
which was
yes.
this 7-part series about Miep Gies. I think I'm mispronouncing her name. One of the people who tried to save Anne Frank and her family. I thought it was extraordinarily well done, and that the actress who plays Miep Gies, Belle Powley, is one of the finest actors of her generation. But then, I had to admit what's number 2 and 3 for me, Rustin and Origin, 2 films that deal directly, explicitly with race, with racial history and tension in the United States. Beautifully done. I thought these were excellent films, and I was expecting a little more love from the Academy for them. the only nomination ends up being Coleman Domingo as Best Actor for his performance as Bayard Rustin. And he was, that's the single best performance I think I've seen this year. So I'm not in sync with Oscar voters sometimes. Oppenheimer is a powerful film, but I found it a little bit too noisy, too loud. I wasn't happy watching it. No, I'm being a little nitpicky here. Certain films I enjoy. I really enjoyed Barbie. Yeah. But I saw it at the Jerusalem Film Festival. It was a late night screening, surrounded by young Israeli girls screaming with glee at the top of their lungs. So that was an experience as opposed to the film itself.
That's great. Do you, I mean, are you able, with all of these millions of thoughts going on in your head, can you just kick back and watch TV and enjoy it?
Yes,
And
but
if yes, what are your favorite really guilty pleasures?
oh no, but this is what I'm about to say is so not a guilty pleasure. You know how I relax? The Late Show with Stephen Colbert. Um, Sundays at 1 p.m. Fareed Zakaria, my former student, by the way, who I think is the most sane and wise of the TV commentators. I was so excited 2 nights ago, Monday night, Jon Stewart was back on The Daily Show. I was like, I was panting with pleasure to see him back again in that old role. But these are obviously not guilty pleasures. I don't know. My husband is watching. If he wants to run in to remind me of a guilty pleasure, great. But I don't think I have one that could be guilty.
You know, like real junk, not, you only watch high quality guilty pleasures.
Well, I guess, although occasionally I'll watch Saturday Night Live, hoping for, sometimes it's delightful, but I miss Kate McKinnon. What can I tell you? That was the main reason I was watching before. Forgive me, I'm literally scraping my brain here trying to think of something that could be called guilty, and nothing is coming to me. I'm sorry.
Don't be sorry. So listen, we are towards the end, but we have a couple of extra minutes. And I did want to just ask you, because I know that people are asking all kinds of things. We just don't have enough time. This is so great. But, I guess I don't know if this is guilty pleasure, but my nosy journalist thing, in all of your interviews, you've interviewed incredible people at the 92nd Street Y. It was a little intimidating interviewing you. I mean, you are so good at this. So is there a moment that just stands out from all those interviews as either a total disaster or as just the best thing since sliced
Okay.
bread?
My husband just sent the answer to your question. He came in and said,
Ah,
you don't have time for guilty pleasures. Okay.
okay,
There's
good.
the answer.
Thank you.
There have been so many wondrous moments at the 92nd Street. I've done over 300 interviews since Real Pieces itself started in 1987, but I was already doing interviews with screenwriters and others prior to that. I mean, when push comes to shove in my brain, Sir Ben Kingsley, because he is so amazingly articulate, intelligent, profound. I mean, he doesn't just answer questions. I'll ask something about craft, and he will give me an extended treatise on how emotion and acting have to be controlled into this particular distillation. That was one of my favorite. Mark told me that I was on stage interviewing Ben Kingsley, and that there were moments when my mouth sort of dropped and I forgot to ask my next question because I was still taking in what he was saying. And he's been my guest 3 times now, if I'm
Oh,
not mistaken.
wow.
He's one of the sort of my little pantheon of 92nd Street Y interviews. I guess some of my favorites are the recurring ones. I mean, Meryl Streep has been there more than once. And she is just, I think, a very regal, warm human being. And I must confess, my most recent interview was so exciting. It was Martin Scorsese. It was the first time he was back on stage with me at the 92nd Street Y since 30 years ago. Um, I love Mark. He doesn't use chat, but he will give me a reminder. Yeah, Kingsley, we both acknowledge he turned prose into poetry. That's we- we're with him. And he was the president of the jury at the Berlin Film Festival. I think it was 1998, and I was on that jury with him. So
Wow.
we all bonded, and also Mark acted in a film that starred Ben Kingsley called The Confession. So Mark knew him first, and then me, and it became a very warm connection. So Martin Scorsese, this was 2 weeks ago or so, a little, or is it already three? January 23rd. My. His passion, his knowledge of film, his ability to articulate how decisions were made, especially for Killers of the Flower Moon. It was very exciting. And the place was packed. There were 900, almost 900 people. And
Wow.
taking in their energy. That's another thing about, doing something on Zoom versus in person. You can't capture the degree of electricity in the room. But
Yeah.
with
Well,
says big time.
thank you so much. We have to wrap it. I will say, just looking at the running commentary in the chat, there's a lot of electricity on the chat. People are just really thrilled
Trying to
with what
keep
you've had to say. And I will say your 92nd Street Wide interviews, you can look at them online. So
not all of them, but there are
quite a few.
you just have
Yeah, so
to
just so people know, just Google it, Real Pieces and Annette Insdorf, and they'll pop up, and it's fun to, it's really, it's not as good as in person, but you can do it in your pajamas, so that's something. Annette, thank you so much for stopping by for Valentine's Day lunch. Happy Valentine's Day. Hope you and Mark are doing something fabulous.
fabulous for us means a quiet evening at home. That's not bad.
Perfect, perfect. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Julie, and goodbye to everyone.
Bye, thank you.